Let's do some drywall.
Drywall repairman here. We're doing another patching video. This one's in a kitchen ceiling. They're doing some renovation in the upstairs bathroom, as you can see through the hole. Above is their shower. They removed the tub, and I guess something happened where they stepped through or something fell through the ceiling and damaged it. And they basically had a LED puck light in here, and the stuff got damaged. So we got called in to get this area all sheetrock patched up and textured with a spray knockdown patch. So first things first, like all repairs that we do, we always plastic off the area. I use masking tape and a roll of plastic. Since this is a spray texture, we basically have to enclose the area to keep the overspray from the spray knockdown going everywhere else except the work area. We're spraying at a high PSI, so you always want to contain your mess. And also something below you to catch all the debris from the demo and the mudding, because drywall is a messy trade. First things first, on this, since the area wasn't that square, I'm going to have to cut it nice and square. Lucky for me, there's studs on each side, so we're cutting center of the stud. The reason we call it center of the stud, because I'm literally cutting to the center of the stud. That way the new sheetrock can have something to screw to, and the old sheetrock. If you don't cut center the studs on these patches when you cut it out, you're going to have to add backing. Lucky for me, I was able to cut it back right on center. So I'm able to screw the sheetrock on the left side and the right side and something in the center. So it's going to be a nice, strong, secure patch. Also, you want to add screws on the outside edge in the old studs. Always do this. What this does, it tightens up the old sheetrock. You're going to put screws in the new sheetrock, but also put screws in the old sheetrock around to tighten it up, especially if it's a push down. That way it tightens up everything. Nothing's loose. You don't want your patch to crack out because you didn't put a few screws in the outside edges. Also, putting these screws in the studs, outside studs, it marks the area so you know where the studs are. But cut it out. This is pretty simple. It's like a 40-inch by 20-inch patch. It's pretty simple. We're going to do, like, I'm going to use a piece of tape, masking tape, and I'm going to take my measurements on the tape and just write it down because I'm cutting the sheetrock outside. I always walk away and I forget my measurement. So it's easier just to write it down so you don't second guess and accidentally cut the sheetrock too small or too big, and then you're out of sheetrock and then you're in trouble. So it's easier just to write it down so you don't forget it. Once you get that piece of sheetrock cut out, then go ahead and put it in place. If you need to, you might have to cut it back a little bit to fit it in the shape. Basically, you're just making your own puzzle piece. It's not going to be perfect because you're cutting out a square area. If you really level it and cut it out perfect, then yeah, it's going to fit nice. But if there's a small gap, don't worry about it because you are going to pre-fill all these. You're going to fiberglass mesh it, and you're going to turn around and float out these patches pretty heavy. So they're going to be filled in, no worries. Put plenty of screws in your patches. I like to put screws every 3 or 4 inches. Rule of thumb, just keeps everything nice and tight. Everybody thinks you just put a couple screws in a patch and you're good. I like to put a lot of screws in so I know it's secure. It's not loose. Maybe you have to do a patch in your project that you're trying to do and you're not comfortable doing the full mudding process and the texture. It is tedious and it is somewhat of an art to mud and texture. So maybe at least you can cut out the area and install the sheetrock, or at least just cut out the area and add framing. So at least you get one step done, and maybe when you're trying to do your drywall project, you'll save some money if you have to hire someone to finish up. But do what you're comfortable doing. Just because you watch a couple of YouTube's videos doesn't mean you're going to get a perfect patch. Anyone can do a cutout. Anybody can install a piece of sheetrock. Anyone can put screws if they have basic drywall tools, hanging tools. So do what you can do. This is 1/2 inch sheetrock. So with 1/2 inch sheetrock and wood, I always use 1.25 inch sheetrock screws, or you can use 1.5 inch, but 1.25 inch screws are the go-to for 1/2 inch sheetrock. If you're doing 5/8, you want to go with a bigger, longer screw, like 1 5/8 inch, or maybe even a 2-inch screw. So on this patch, I got it all hung, but I have to install the LED puck light. This is the only thing about these puck lights. They're awesome, nice, easy to install. But if you ever have damage in the ceiling, you're going to have to reinstall them after you sheetrock, because they literally just clamp onto the sheetrock. That's the only thing holding them up is the little clamps on these remodel LED puck lights. So you got to get the measurements right where you're going to put it. You want to just measure twice, cut once with these circle cutters. I'm just taking measurement off the other LED light that I see, and I'm trying to get everything centered. So you want to measure it out, measure once, measure twice. If you have a round circle template, you can use that. Like here, I'm using a piece of drywall that I had, but I was told to use a circle cutter. Since we had a circle cutter on hand, he's going to basically get it all adjusted for me to do like a 5.5 inch, 6 inch round circle. These circle cutters are easy to use once you figure them out. You just got to get them dialed in. Make sure you cut the sheetrock perfectly square. It basically just scores the sheetrock nice and deep. And then you usually can follow it with like a keyhole saw and then just cut it out so you get a nice perfect circle. These are perfect tool. They don't make a lot of dust and debris. I know a lot of people use like roto zips and stuff like that. With these circle cutters, it just keeps the dust down. It just takes a little more time, a little more precision to get them right. Once I get it cut, I'm just going to cut each side with the keyhole saw and just pop out the broken pieces. No problem. Or you can follow it with a razor blade where you scored it with the circle cutter and just snap it. It's all you have to do with these circles. Any goobers or anything in your sheetrock inside the sheetrock circle, you can just go over it with your razor blade to just clean it up. Once you get these holes cut out, you want to double check and put one of those puck lights back in. Make sure you're on the money. You want to make sure you didn't cut it too big and just do everything. I could also done this after I mud and texture, but it's easier to cut this out before I start mudding and making a big old mess. So it's easier for me to do it on the raw sheetrock before I get this all taped, coated, and textured. I'm sure I could have left it to the next guy that comes in there to install it, but I'm just installing this all now so they just get a finished product. They don't have to try to do it themselves or have to hire someone just to come install a little LED puck light that just screws in. But the fittings fits good. It looks good. So I'm going to take the puck light out and put it to the side. And now we're ready for the taping process. With the taping process, you always want to go through anything you're going to tape beforehand and scrape it. Get any boogers. If any screw heads are sticking out, you want to make sure all those screw heads are countersucking the sheetrock. You don't want no screw heads sticking out because it'll mess you up when you go taping and mudding. I'm using a spray glue. The spray glue, of course, is an optional product. The reason I'm doing this is because I'm tacking the fiberglass to the ceiling and it's tacking to the old sheetrock. I don't want the tape to fall down on me. That's the only reason I'm using that spray glue. It's an optional product. A little goes a long way. It's just to tack the tape in place, hold it in place. Gets pushed down nice and good on the old sheetrock and the patch. If you have any big gaps, you could do 2 layers of fiberglass. Why not? If you're concerned that it's going to crack, just do 2 layers. There's so many different fiberglass tapes out there and tape techniques and stuff like this. But this fiberglass works good. You just got to use it correctly. Make sure it's pushed down. Everything's sitting nice. You don't want big clumps of fiberglass here and there. You want it sitting nice and flush with the sheetrock, overlapping the old sheetrock. So it's nice tape seams. Any gaps, like I said, just double layer it. Just makes a nice strong patch. Once you get everything all taped up, now you're ready for your first coat process. Like I said in all my videos, if you don't do a lot of mudding, just coat with a joint compound. Use joint compounds. Joint compounds you have to let dry overnight and then turn around, sand it, then do another coat, then let that dry overnight and then come do another coat. They shrink back in between coats. I'm using a 5-minute hot mud. The reason I use these hot muds, it's a stronger material. It doesn't crack, but it sets up fast and strong. It almost sets up like a cement plaster on the patch. So you got to really work with it quick. It's more of a professional grade material, so you don't want to use it unless you've worked with a lot of drywall muds before, so you can manipulate the hot muds as they're setting up. If you're just trying to do a simple patch at your house, just buy some joint compound. Don't buy spackle, don't buy lightweight, just a regular all-purpose joint compound. It's cheap, it's easy to use. If you make any mistakes, you can sand away your mistakes. With these hot muds, once they set up, you get what you buy. It sets up strong. In the bags, it says easy sandable product, but you don't sand hot muds. If someone says they sand hot muds, they don't know what they're talking about. Sure, you can sand it, but you'd be better off trying to sand cement because that's how strong it's going to set up. With the hot muds, they set up. Like I'm using a 5-minute, it's going to set up, I'd say between 5. Sometimes it takes up to 10 minutes if you're putting a patch on like a semi-gloss wall. So it takes a little longer on semi-gloss. You also want to use fresh, clean water when you're mixing hot muds. The hot mud, I'm just going to strike in. You would do the same thing with a joint compound. You want to strike in your tape. You're pushing that mud inside the grooves, the gaps, inside all the little netting of the fiberglass. You're getting it pushed in the grooves, the nooks and crannies of that fiberglass. This is how you use it. You get it pushed in there. You don't just coat over everything right away. You want to push that stuff in there. Some guys like to go through and pre-fill the patch before they tape it. That's fine. You could do the same technique. Push the mud inside the gap and then follow it while the mud's still wet with your fiberglass and then slick it out so the fiberglass sits nicely. But I just tape it with the fiberglass. I push the mud inside the grooves of the tape and then I follow around and do a nice first coat over everything. I'm going to take the mud coat past the area. Joint compounds, everybody always says, put it on heavy because it's going to shrink back. Sure, you can do that with regular joint compounds because they do shrink back a little bit overnight. But with these hot muds, they don't shrink back as much, so you don't want to put them on too heavy. You don't want a big old hump on your patch, big old wavy humped patch because you put on the materials too heavy. Sometimes a little bit goes a long way. You're just trying to coat the patch. So need be, if it needs another coat, you can follow through with the second coat, then follow through with the third coat if need be. And if it's really bad, follow through with the tight 4th coat. But you don't need to put a big old heavy coat with these hot muds. Once I get it all coated out, I'm going to clean up my tools, get them all cleaned up. My knives, get all the mud out of my pan, get everything cleaned up. You don't want this hot mud setting up on your tools, because then you're going to be scraping and sanding your metal tools, and it's going to be a real nightmare. So it's easier to clean it right away. If you have a washout area with the hose is best, or you could do it in a bucket of water with a sponge. Just get everything cleaned up as your hot mud's setting up. Once it starts setting up, you want to check it. If you could touch it and it's not soaking wet and leaving finger marks in it, then it's time to slick out. You want to catch this material as it's setting up, not after it sets up. If it sets up after and then you try to manipulate it, it's going to be very difficult. So you want to catch it as it's setting up. If anybody ever worked with cement, stuccos, grout, stuff like that, you know you have to let the material kind of set up, and then you can manipulate the material with a damp sponge. And here I'm using a 6-inch knife. I'm basically taking off the extra mud. I'm pushing it inside all the grooves, waves. I'm feathering off the edge. Definitely want to feather the edge where the mud work meets old texture. Feather that edge with your sponge to get rid of that edge. You're just basically going every direction. You're manipulating the material, taking off the extra material. The mud on your knife also helps fill in any gouges or any mistakes. If you do a nice first coat and then you slick it out just right, it's almost like a second coat. So when you work with this material a lot, you get really efficient with it by making 1 or 2 coats turn into a finished product. But get it all slicked out, hurry up before it really sets up, and then go. I like to always follow the patch edges again right when I'm done to just get rid of that edge, feather in that edge before it fully sets up. This is the technique, though, only for hot muds. You don't do this with joint compounds. Joint compounds, you just literally be done after you first coat, and you have to come back the next day and then sand it with like 80 grit, 150 grit sandpaper, and then follow through with another tight second coat. Once I get it all slicked out, this first coat slicked out, I'm just going to follow through with a second coat. I'm going to use a second coat of 5-minute mud again, and just going to do a tight coat over everything. Sometimes you can go the opposite direction as your first coat, and you want to go a little past your first coat. Your second coat is just going to fill in any imperfections, anything you missed, any deep areas, it fills those in. Once the second coat starts setting up, it's just like the first coat. I'm going to have to slick it out. You're going to have to slick out in between all the coats. You can't turn away from your slick out process. You can't. Once you coat it, you're going to have to slick it out. Don't just coat it and walk away from the job. If you don't have enough time, at least stay and work enough to slick it out until your next step. You have to slick out in between coats before it sets up, or you're going to be in big trouble. I've worked behind guys where they did a hot mud coat and they were done for the day and they come back, or I got sent to the job to fix someone else's work that I was working, co-worker, you would say. And then I had a big mess on my hands because I left their hot mud to set up without slicking it out. So always slick out your hot muds. If this was just a joint compound, then you would just sand in between coats. That's why it's easier to work with a joint compound. Just sand in between coats. Get it all slicked out, any imperfections, fix those with the extra mud on your knife as you're slicking out. After this second coat slick out, if it's still in bad shape, if the patch still looks kind of rough, then just follow through with a tight third coat. And then on this, we're going to be doing a spray texture. So maybe where you're located, you might have a smooth texture. If you had like a smooth texture, you would just follow it through on the third coat, maybe with a tight skim of joint compound and leave it smooth. Maybe you're trying to do a patch and it has a texture, but you're not comfortable doing the texture. Well, maybe you can do these step process, get it all coated out, and then just skim it out real tight with the joint compound, and then maybe later on hire someone just to come in and do the texture. So just do what you're comfortable with. But most patches, different areas, they're smooth, so you just leave it smooth and call it a day. Before I texture this, I'm going to double check that puck light. Since I'm mudded everything, I want to make sure this thing fits in, because it's easier to do it now while this second coat mud is set up, because if I try to put this in after I texture it, I might mess up my texture. So I want to make sure everything's good to go before I do a wet joint compound texture over this. Just put that puck light to the side and just double check it. Since I pushed this inside the hole, it made some imperfections around it, so I'm going to double check everything. This is the time you double check everything, make sure everything looks good and it's ready for texture. Most people ask me, how do you know the patch is ready for texture? I just say, well, if I paint it right now, would it be perfect, smooth patch? If they say yes, then it's ready for texture. If it still looks rough, it needs another coat. With this, I'm just doing a spray knockdown, doing a spray hopper here, and I'm using a joint compound. I do not ever use hot muds for texture, especially spray textures. I don't want to run hot muds through this hopper. There's some instances where we had to turn around and paint the patch. Then I might have to do hot muds textures, but we prefer to use a joint compound. The joint compound is mixed up like a creamy, heavy pancake batter consistency. It's mixed thoroughly, no clumps in it. It's just a creamy, perfect mud that's been mixed very good. Once I get it all sprayed with the knockdown, I'm going to follow through and knock it down. I had some guy leave me a comment saying that, hey, you need to let this mud set up before you knock it down. No, not on a joint compound on patchwork. I like to knock down stuff right away. I'm using a straight 6-inch knife that's clean and a damp sponge to take any mud off my knife. You would use bigger knockdown knives if you're doing bigger projects. But with these patchwork, it's easier to use a nice straight 6-inch knife where you can control your knockdown pressure just by gliding over it. And you're just knocking it down little by little because you don't want a bunch of flat spots. There's a lot of big knockdown knives out there. Those are good. You know, if I'm doing like a whole ceiling with all new sheetrock and everything's perfect and straight, then it'll make a good knockdown for those big knives. But just patchwork, just stick with your 6-inch knife. Just lightly knock it down, trowel it down. You can look at your existing texture to know if it's a really flat knockdown or if it's a light knockdown. And stuff like that, it's really hard to tell you how to do it. That's just working with your air compressor and your hopper and spraying techniques, just doing so many jobs, you kind of get it dialed in. Knowing your equipment, I guess you would say. Knowing your tools and your mud mixture. So you're going to have to practice if you never did a knockdown before. This is when you need to be a higher professional if you don't know what you're doing, or you're going to have an ugly patch. But basically got it all knocked down. It looks good. I pulled the masking. I'm going to go ahead and try to attempt to put this puck light in. I'm going to take it easy. I don't want to make a big mess of my texture, so I'm going to make sure it fits in perfectly without damaging my texture. Get it all screwed in. Of course, in the ideal world, you want to put these in after you primer and paint everything. But since we got called in to do the patch, we're going to just install this for them to make it easy for everybody so everybody's happy. There's no hole in their ceiling when we leave. So everything works. Good to go. We know it fits.